a lot of what my research has focused on is the role of game masters in tabletop role-playing games. Game masters basically take on the role of the environment and the other characters in the world that aren't represented by the other player characters. So it presents challenges, controls the environment, represents like sort of the dialogue with other characters in the world. And there's a lot going on in this process. So, you have to be a good storyteller, you have to be entertaining, you have to sort of build a story based on the things that the players want to do. And that can be very difficult. It obviously involves a lot of sort of on-the-fly improvisation. A lot of what game masters do, or GMs do, is similar to the kinds of things that are the goals of computational storytelling or different areas of procedural narrative system. How do we adapt a story to fit the things that the players want to do? How do we maybe create a story that has certain dramatic beats or that pulls in things from the past while still allowing players a large degree of freedom to do what they want in the world? Sort of the goal of my current trend in research is not creating computational systems that can sort of supplant the GM. So there's sort of several different existing lines of work regarding tabletop role-playing games. One being like, how do we sort of, digitize the GM, or how do we create like a digital version that a player can play with? And I'm not terribly interested in that, though I think it's an interesting line of work. Instead, I'm interested in sort of the human side of things, or keeping the human in the loop. So how do we create computational systems that can serve as sort of creativity support or mitigate that fear of the blank slate? A lot of what GMs talked about is trying to get players invested in the story. So like, how do we capture players' attention and get them sort of hooked? One way is by providing players with things that they want to see in the world. So GMs would do things like look at a player's character sheet and see, like if they're playing a rogue, maybe that means that they want to be sneaky. Another thing that GMs talked about is sort of helping to motivate players, giving them reasons to play in the world through the characters in that world. So having players that like NPCs in the world is very helpful because, the players might be like, oh, no, I don't really want to do a thing. But like if your friend NPC who you really like asks you to do a thing, then you're like, okay, I'll do it for you. So trying to create those personal bonds between the players and the characters of the world in order to get players to do the things that you want, basically. In terms of agency and consequence, we see a lot of emphasis that GMs have on wanting to have players feel like their actions like really have an impact, right? So one way in which a GM talked about sort of doing this process is creating a world with momentum, with the idea being that the world is sort of headed in a particular direction. Things are going to happen, events are going to play out. The example that this GM used is like there's this revolution that's going to happen and it's going to fail unless the players choose to intervene. And if the players intervene, then maybe they can actually change the course of what's going to happen. The idea behind this is that the world sort of has its own agency and both player action is rewarded, so players can change the course of events, but player inaction also has consequence. So maybe players, they can only do so much in the world. They can choose to help this group or this other group. And whatever they choose not to do is also sort of a choice. A lot of what GMs talked about is sort of thinking through logically, using the sort of logic of the world in order to determine what the consequences are for when players choose to do things. We also looked at how GMs sort of planned for their games because that process is sort of important as well. We see that there's this trend of GMs, particularly the expert GMs, not wanting to, plan out specific things that they want to happen during any particular game session, but instead creating content that's more modular and can sort of be slotted in as needed. So in terms of a larger story structure, GMs might have, particular beats that they want to hit, but not necessarily be like, oh, well, today we're going to plot point A, and then tomorrow we're going to plot point B. Instead, GMs seem to lean a lot more on randomization and allowing sort of the emergent gameplay that happens through players exploring the world. So instead of being like, I'm planning things around this event A happening and then event B happening, it's more like, oh, players can sort of do whatever they want. They can go in any direction, sort of treating the world more as a sandbox. You could use sort of randomization to come up with the actual gameplay on the fly. GMs talked about sort of not wanting to plan out, oh, well, the players are going to find this person and they're going to solve this problem this particular way, but instead creating conflict and maybe not necessarily even having solutions for them. So, the players might encounter a problem and they might be like, oh, well, how are we supposed to deal with this? Well, that's up to the players and up to whatever they come up with on the fly. Specific encounters can be sort of slotted in as necessary. So one GM talked about sort of planning out, oh, well, maybe I'll make a couple of different kinds of encounters for when I need like a creepy encounter or I need a particularly difficult encounter, and just sort of pulling those in as necessary. Obviously, improvisation is very important to tabletop role-playing games, and in talking to GMs, they talked about improvisation a lot in their interviews. One note with improvisation, this quote is from one of the GMs in our interviews, is that expert GMs tended to really like improvisation. And they talk about, like that's the whole reason I play the game. I really don't want to prep. I just sort of want to, do my thing. Whereas the novice GMs seem to struggle the most with improvisation. And they would say things like, oh, I don't really know how to keep my players on track. I don't know what do I do when they just sort of go off the rails? So we see this sort of as the beginning of a point of divergence between novice GMs and expert GMs. Like, how can we create computational support systems, particularly for new GMs, to sort of support that story improvisation that seems to come through this process of actually, playing the game a ton, but is not necessarily written down anywhere. Just creating the information in a more accessible form for GMs. So if for those of you who have played before, you might know, you get little module, a paper module that has lists of characters and locations and descriptions and all of that. And during play, you might be sort of rifling through that, or if you have a digital copy going through a PDF. Now there are slightly more accessible versions, having hyperlinks to specific stat blocks for creatures and things like that. But I think that this could definitely be improved upon in terms of how GMs can access information. So basically putting things in a database such that GMs can quickly sort through the information that they want, and then letting GMs make changes to that as well, because a lot of what GMs talked about is sort of pulling out what they want, or players, doing things that are unexpected during play, and GMs needing to keep track of that. So letting the GMs update the database based on the things that happen in the world. Finally, we get this sort of idea of improvisational suggestions, which is probably the hardest out of all of these to implement, but also the most interesting from sort of a computational narrative perspective. How do we create this sort of knowledge base that represents all of the information in the game world, but also allows the GM to make changes? And how do we sort of layer on top of that this improvisational suggestion for GMs, or computational support for creativity? This is a diagram of different story paths through an introductory module, Lost Mine of Phandelver. And all of the different characters and information in the game and the locations are represented in these JSON files that are used to generate this flowchart. This is a little web tool based on a Prolog database that basically contains information about all of the characters and information in the game world. And this can also be used to generate that visualization. With the idea being that if we store all of this in a Prolog database, then we can quickly pull out and access information. And then this can be as simple as we want like maybe the characters have done this much in the story so far, and we want to provide them with a little bit more to do. Like, what's the next plot hook we can give them? But it could also be pulling out interesting relationships and character information, such as, interesting rivals in the story, or recurring a villain that, the players had encountered before. And I hope that this research is not just interesting for people that are interested in like tabletop role-playing games or digital assistants or whatever, but also has this sort of wider implication on the field of procedural narrative systems and how humans and computers can tell stories together.